things is that it's a follow-on from, I wrote this book, The War on the West, which you and I discussed when it came out about 18 months ago. And since then, there have been so many things that have happened, not least the 7th of October and the war that's followed. Because I've covered all of this up close and got some pretty extraordinary camera footage of this, I wanted to present it to an audience to be able to show what I've seen and what I think of as the realities that I think a lot of people are running away from at the moment. But the realities of what happens when, frankly, when violence breaks out. And I think it's a great warning to people in America and elsewhere. A great warning of, this stuff can become very real, as it did in Israel last October. And anyhow, there's going to be some fun to be had along the way. My friend and colleague from the Monk debates in Toronto, Natasha Hausdorff, is going to be with me on stage to do the Q&A session and interview. And yes, and there's going to be a lot of never before seen footage from a lot of crazy situations.
So it sounds in some ways like a live current affairs show that's focused specifically on this issue. Okay, so you said that you're going to use, if I've got it right, you're going to use the occurrences of October 7th and afterwards as an object lesson, right? An object lesson in the consequences, of the disintegration of a societal ethos, the consequences of how do you exactly do you tie in what you were writing about in the War on the West with what you've seen unfold since October 7th, say in relationship to what you're going to speak about?
Well, one thing is, of course, is that October 7th for a lot of people in Israel was an example of what happens when you've been living in a delusion and are suddenly woken up from that. I've written a lot in recent years, as have others, about the way in which in all the Western democracies we've had a sort of lack of seriousness, really, about some of the threats that we face. There's a slumberingness that's gone on for a long time, which I and others have warned against. But I suppose, among other things, of course, it's not just about that. It's about how people react in the face of real threat and real crisis. And that's one of the things that I'm very interested in at the moment, is the way in which a terrible situation like that throws up these two completely counter forces. One is the force of real evil and what it's like to stare into the face of real evil. The other is, of course, the face of true heroism. The people who, in the face of atrocity, become the person that they were meant to be. And I've seen a lot of that in the last year. And I think there are enormous lessons to be learned, not just of the negatives, but the positives of the way in which actually, when extraordinary events occur, extraordinary people are thrown up. And, we might all see a bit more of that in the years ahead.
So in what manner do you view what happened on October 7th and afterwards as a reflection of the sorts of things that you were warning about in War on the West? How do you see it as another step in the logical unfolding of the processes that you were assessing?
Well, it's partly from that and partly from the previous books, including my one, The Strange Death of Europe, that came out in 2017. A lot of that was concerned with saying, look, there are deep, deep challenges that are going on to what we used to call the liberal democratic society, and a deep unwillingness of people to realize that those challenges were not metaphorical. Since the 7th of October, we've seen unbelievable scenes on everywhere from the streets of London and major cities in Europe to the most elite campuses of Northern America, Ivy League campuses, where students who have the most privileged existence imaginable have decided to openly throw their lot in with the terrorists of Hamas. This has gone further, a lot faster, I think, than a lot of people realized. But it is something I've been warning about for a very long time. That yes, there are deep things happening in our society, including the what I've described in the past as being the thing of people at risk of rebelling for the sake of rebellion and out of boredom. And this is a deep thing in American society in particular. You know, the call for a great cause. One of the student protesters at Columbia was quoted in New York Magazine the other month saying that he was a first-generation low-income student who was the first member of his family to go to university. And you think, well, that sounds good. And then he went on to say, and when I got to Columbia, I learned about the rich history of protest at Columbia. And I decided, he said, I knew that as soon as it kicked off, I wanted to be in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
so
yeah,
let me
wow.
ask you about let me ask you about that in some more detail. So this is going to be a complicated question, but you put your finger on something that's.
So before Jordan tees up with his question and takes his time to ask that question with the the only way that Jordan Peterson knows how, by putting in those beautiful words in that language, and then finally serving up that question to his guests on a platter for them to answer. Before we get to that, I just wanted to sort of give you my 2 cents worth. And first of all, to say when Douglas Murray was talking about everything stemming from all of his travels and going into the war-torn areas in the aftermath of October 7th, and basically saying that it was like almost waking up from a deep sleep, like a hibernation of the Israeli nation, to basically have this terrorist act, perpetrated upon them. And I think when we look down and we write about this in history, I would basically say that October 7th could very well be recognized as the 9/11 of Israel, where nearly, like I said, 12 to 1,500 people, children, parents, grandparents, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers, they died in that attack. And nearly half of what occurred in 9/11 here in the United States on that, on that day. And as Douglas is talking about that, yes, I think that people don't realize. They really don't realize, and they forget. I mean, listen, folks, how far away are we really from World War II, the end of World War II? If you want to start talking about, like, let's say 1940, all right, you're talking literally what, 84 years, right? 84 years ago. The atrocities, the concentration camps, the murdering, the jailing, the incarceration, the concentration camps of the Jewish people and others by the Nazi regime and Adolf Hitler and his ilk. And so how quickly, I mean, we're talking in the lifespan of humanity, 84 years, it's like a blimp. It's like a tiny little speck on the entire time frame. And so people tend to forget. And then they tend to say, oh, we can talk to these people. We can talk to them. We can sit down. We can negotiate. Folks, you can negotiate and sit down to terms with some people that aren't zealots, that aren't fanatical. But when you have a terrorist group like Hamas or ISIS or the Taliban, now I'll give you, there's just a side note. Trump talks about when he was sitting down with the Taliban leader, and I think one of the congressmen or senators, somebody who was part of that team, was in the room. And Trump turns to the interpreter and basically says, tell so-and-so that I know exactly where his house is, his family, and everybody else that he likes and loves. And if any harm comes to any American soldier, American citizen in Afghanistan, or anything is started, guess what? You're not going to have a home anymore. And you know what I mean. He used those words, right? And the interpreter turns and says, tell him. And he did. Do you realize that not a single U.S. soldier, there was no casualty, a death, nothing happened? Until when? Until Joe Biden decides to leave Afghanistan, and then 13 American soldiers are murdered and killed. That's the difference, folks, between we don't want America to become a sleeping giant. And as Douglas basically is saying, it's a warning out there to America. Look at what he was talking about is happening on the campuses across America. Elite institutions of some of the most privileged people from all walks of life, whether you're white, black, brown, Asian, Latino, Hispanic, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, whatever. It's a privileged institution to go to these upper echelons of academia. And so what did he say? He basically mentioned, the quote from that one student whose first time he's getting to go to college, and the first person in his family to go to college, and he's not from the elite, tea sipping, totaling, people on the east side of New York or whatever. And what's he say? When these sit-ins and protests and everything else started, oh, guess what? I have got to be a part of that. That's what's happening, folks, these days. That's what's happening in campuses. Our young children are being indoctrinated into socialist, Marxist, values that have nothing to do with democracy. Nothing at all. Anyways, let's get back to more of the interview, folks. You're watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I'm your host, Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. Let's get back to more of Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray. We'll do that right now.
Psychological rather than political, or even spiritual, let's say, rather than political. As you know from touring with me, I've been investigating. One of the things I've been investigating is, what is it that makes life worthwhile? I talked to a philosopher this week on my podcast who has written a couple of books on a stream of analytic philosophy that's been debating whether or not, if you weighed up the evidence en masse, whether existence itself is a net good or a net evil, with whatever implications you might want to draw from that argument for its creator. Right. So I'm not trying to make a theological case, but part of this inquiry is like, if there was a God, is it more logical to conceive of him as good or as evil? And underneath that is a sense that the proper axis of evaluation for such a question is whether there's more pain and misery in the world or pleasure. And my sense is that the fact that that's how the argument is constituted is actually an indication of the pathology of our culture, because it's a fool's game to map pleasure and pain onto good and evil, partly because there are evil pleasures and there are morally justifiable pains, right? So whatever the landscape, whatever the moral landscape is, it's not reducible to the hedonic landscape and any axiomatic assumption that it is. Okay, so there's a corollary to that. And one of the corollaries would be, well, if we're not built to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, let's say, which is a powerful argument because emotions are powerful and the positive and negative emotion systems are powerful motivating systems. But if we're not built to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, then what's the cardinal call to existence? And my sense is that it's something akin to adventure. Maybe it's romantic adventure, which is an even better formulation. All right, so then let's say if that's the case, and you and I talked about this the last time we talked about the truth as part of the call to adventure.
The heroic adventure, yes.
Exactly. Well, so then if that's the case and the cardinal motivation in life is something like the heroic call to adventure, then you might ask yourself, well, what if that's not being pursued? What beckons as an ersatz alternative? And like certainly protest in the name of a ideology,
the name
is
of a cause is a
false
very
adventure.
It's very tempting. It's very tempting. I mean, I would say that in general, the purpose, finding purpose in a higher cause is, of course, one of the most useful ways to find a meaning in your life beyond the maximization of pleasure. Unfortunately, the rebellious attitude for the sake of rebellion becomes extremely appealing. Another of the students at Columbia, I'm sorry to hark on about it, but it does show a rot somewhere, at elite institutions. One of the other students at Columbia said that it started the year out as a protest in October against the climate emergency, the climate crisis. And, within a month, it was Hamas.
So one of the things I noticed, I suppose it was in about 2014, which was approximately when I was starting to detect that something had gone seriously wrong with the universities, let's say. One of the things I did recognize amongst my colleagues was this axiomatic presumption that part of what the universities were there for was to teach young people how to be moral by protesting. That protest itself had become a stand-in for morality. And so, you can feel some sympathy for that kid that you were describing. I mean, he's gone off to an elite institution hoping to be taught how to live a good life in the classic sense by the world's most profound experts. And what he found when he got there was that since the 1960s, the best thing that the universities have to offer to their students is the false reputation, the false claim to morality that can be had, and the excitement that can be had by engaging in a protest. And
yes, the life of an activist is the ideal life, and the life that's rewarded and the life that is seen to be virtuous. I mean, it's all of that. And by the way, one of the other things that has struck me very much in recent times has been the fact that, of course, a lot of the problems that we see emerging in our societies in the West come about not just from that boredom, but of course the fact that when the financial tide goes out and stops being able to lift people up, a lot of other stuff gets revealed. We see this in the UK at the moment. It's not by any means the only explanation for the riots that have been going on. But if you look at all of the northern towns in which the riots have been going on, the material well-being of the population has declined in the last 13 years since the last set of riots. And you sort of think, well, if the society isn't working for you financially, and joblessness has actually gone up, and on top of that you have challenges to your identity, well, of course there's a cause right there. And not an ignoble one. If it's about saying, I want to defend my culture and all of that, ignoble once somebody thinks that the best way of doing that is to pick up a brick and throw it at a policeman or at a place of worship.
Yeah, well, it's
Great stuff once again by just two brilliant, brilliant minds. And all I like to say, in reference to this, is that when Douglas is answering that question, and Jordan postulates the fact that, hey, you know what, maybe you can feel some sympathy for this, this student who is basically, finally getting to go to an institution where maybe he's been dreaming of going to learn from the great academics, so he perceives the great professors that are there at these Ivy League institutions. And then when he gets there, he finds out that, the best avenue to advocate for what he's doing is to be a virtue signaling, leftist, to be virtue signaling as a student, to use activism, to use protests. That's the highest form of achievement. It's really not about your grades. It's really not about your job. But boy, if you can just become an activist for something out there, climate change, global, global tensions for whatever, migration, immigration, legal, illegal immigration. You pick the topic that's out there. And if you can be an activist and you can protest, that's what it's all about. That's what it means. Whether, and then in terms of their protest, that it's just coming from the point of view that you've got to do anything within your power to stop something, even though the majority of the people like are in agreement, and you happen to be in the minority. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Sheikh Show. I'm your host, Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow. You all know what to do. Check out our video links above and below. I'll leave with my final thought, which is, when you're right, you're right. And when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.